Right everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you've all had a good Christmas and a happy festive period. Anyway, let's get on with this. So in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about how to deal with cold weather when you're wild camping. But more specifically, I'm going to get into the routine around being in your tent, transitioning from being wet and cold outside to trying to be dry and warm inside, and how to go about doing that in a way which is going to mean that you have a good experience versus one where it can turn into trouble or a bit of a nightmare. But firstly, I have to preface this by saying that you should always try and get as much information as possible before you attempt stuff like that, and also that you should try and practice something if it's your first time camping in cold conditions, that you can easily get out of that situation if you need to. Maybe be within like half a mile of your car or accommodation or something like that, where if it really goes wrong you can just get out, because we can sometimes think that the gear we've got is going to work and then we try and do it and it's a total disaster. And there'd be nothing worse than being freezing cold, like chilled to the bone, and in the dark can't get back to warmth and you're stuck, and then that can become a mountain rescue situation. So the purposes of this video, this is just information about how I do things. Don't see this as a be all and end all tutorial in any means whatsoever. Go out and find out more information, and I always suggest that people attend a proper winter skills course at an accredited institution, because that will teach you a lot of the additional skills that you need to survive in the cold climates. Anyway, let's get on to this. When you're out hiking in really cold weather, one thing that people aren't always aware of is that the outer layer of fat that you've got on your body, whilst that will insulate you whilst you're outside, what happens is that layer of fat that's on you and your sort of skin and everything become cold. Your inside stays warm, but the outside becomes cold. If you allow your outer layer of insulation on your body, which is your fat, even if you don't have much fat on you, to become cold, what happens to you when you stop walking is that fat that's on the outside, which is now cold, starts to suck the heat away from your inside. When you're producing heat when you're walking, it's not a problem, but when you stop producing heat when you're walking, the heat that's in your body will now be used to heat up those fat cells, and that can cause a problem. So the first thing that you have to do is we have to make sure that our outer insulating fat, if you like, doesn't get that cold in the first place. One of the best things you can do in order to stop that from getting so cold is to make sure that your outer body is windproof, because that wind chill really has the most cooling effect on the body. You need to have insulation and be warm, but being windproof really makes the world of difference. The other thing we have to make sure is that we don't get wet, or we try to minimize the amount that we do get wet. Now, I'm not going to say that you're not going to get wet. Some climates that you go into, this is why I think Scotland is in some ways harder to survive in than places like Canada, is because whilst Canada gets technically colder, if you've ever been to Canada, it's like a really dry cold. Whereas in Scotland, everything gets wet. Like, it just seems to get into everything. You can't kind of protect it. It's more like a clock that ticks down until everything seems to be soaked. It's a much harder experience, I think, because of that humidity in the air, which is a real problem. We have to watch out for that. So let's talk about how to deal with some of these things. When we're talking about the clothing part, it's important that the clothing system is right before we start talking about the tent, because we need to arrive to our tent in the correct condition. That means whilst we might be a bit cold or we might be a bit wet, we want to try and minimize those effects as much as possible. We need to understand that when we're walking in winter conditions, we don't necessarily need tons of insulation layers on us at that point, because we're going to generate a lot of body heat when we're walking, especially when you're going uphill, but just generally walking in a mountainous environment or a hilly environment is going to make us produce a lot of heat. And if we get too hot, we're going to sweat a lot. If we sweat too much, it might not be raining, but we're going to start getting wet on the inside, because our layers are going to start keeping that moisture in. So what you want to think about is a system of layers. You want to start with a base layer. It can be synthetic or wool based, but never cotton. it's really important that you avoid cotton. If that's new information to you, what you need to understand is that when cotton gets wet, firstly, it takes a very, very long time to dry out, and secondly is that it has this kind of thermal conductivity property to it when it's wet, which means that your body loses heat at an incredibly fast rate, and it can lead to hypothermia very, very quickly, and the stuff just doesn't dry out. It just takes way too long to dry out for it to be practical. And I think that it's probably one of the big causes of hypothermia in people is that they wear cotton. So the first rule for you is that cotton is out, and you can look online and find out more about that. If that's new to you, then that's probably the first thing that you really need to pay attention to, is that cotton, in terms of anything that you're wearing, is just out of the question. Don't do it. Look for synthetic and look for wools. Now, I'm not going to spend a long time on the clothing section in this video, because I want to get into like the camping routine. But essentially you can look at things like Paramo, you can look at different layering systems where you have then fleece and then maybe an insulated jacket of some sort, and then a waterproof jacket over the top, and the same for your trousers as well. You look at the different types of trousers, but you need to be thinking that you have to have the ability to have waterproof trousers and a waterproof jacket. They're going to be an absolute must, and that you can take layers off and cool yourself down if you need to, because even though it can be snow and it can be a cold air temperature, if there's not much wind, you're putting out a lot of exertion in the activities you're doing, you can get hot really quickly. So you want to try to not sweat too much, and if you do sweat, you want to be able to let that evaporate off you. The other thing that's really important in terms of keeping your body temperature up is that you eat whilst you're on the move. You have to keep eating, because the only heat source when you're out is your body. You have to generate the heat yourself. You've got to understand that your insulation layers will only trap the heat that your body's making. It's not going to produce heat for you. So if you're shivering and freezing cold and you put an insulation layer on, it's going to take you really long time to heat up, because it doesn't actually produce any heat for you. Unless you're taking like a hot water bottle or something, or you're eating hot food. At the point when you're walking, you're the only thing that's producing that heat. Now, in order for your body to produce heat, you can move or you can eat food, because when you eat food and you've got calories, your body can use that to generate heat and keep you warm. So let's say you're going on a hike and it's a long distance. If you just drink and you don't eat anything on the way, you could run the risk that when you get to the camp and you're tired and exhausted, that your body hasn't got any calories in it to start making more heat. And then as you stop moving, your body's now not producing any body heat from the exercise, because that's stopped. Your body's got not enough calories to then compensate and try to generate heat with, and you can get cold really quickly. So it's important that you understand that you've got to have some food in you as well. And I always try to make a point that when I'm about half an hour, 45 minutes away from where I want to make camp, that I'll definitely make sure that I eat something then as well. But I think it'd be a good idea to have something every hour and a half or so whilst you're walking anyway, just to keep those calorie levels up, because as you get more tired, you're more likely to make mistakes. It's going to cloud your thinking. All of those things can become problems for you as you're going along. But you need your body, make it easy for your body to generate heat. You can think of food as being logs on the fire. That's essentially it. It's just logs on the fire for you. And you want to keep topping that up so that it's just not going out. If it gets down to a smolder or there's not much heat being produced, where's the heat supposed to come from? It's not going to just magically appear. You have to make it. And in order to do that, you have to put logs on the fire. And that's where your food comes in. Okay, so let's say we get to our camp. We've had some food already on the way. So maybe we haven't got tons of calories in us, but there's something there still. We've still got some heat being produced. We put our tent up and we get into our tent. Now, the things that we need to focus on now, because this is the point where we stop generating heat from exercise. Okay, that means we have to now start trapping the heat that we are producing, and that we need to make sure that we're losing as little as possible. And then we need to make sure that we can carry on generating heat. So the first thing I do is I get changed out of my wet clothes or my walking clothes. I use a microfiber towel. I dry myself off as best as I can. And then I get into a dry layer, dry base layers. You can have even a dry set of trousers if you want. and then a down jacket. I don't hike in a down jacket because they're not very good when they're wet. But I put my down jacket on, and then that down jacket is really good insulation when I'm dry inside to then trap that body heat that I'm producing. I put a new dry hat on and new dry gloves, usually some really thin ones. Even liner gloves can be good when you're in your tent. Depends on how cold it is where you are. You have to judge that for yourself. That's why I say try this stuff out closer to home or closer to a car so you can get out if you need to and you got it wrong. So depending on your climates, it depends on how much insulation you need to wear at that point. But the principle is that the first thing is that we need to go from wet to dry. Now those wet clothes that we've got, I'm going to assume they're wet from either from sweating, from rain, or whatever it is. It's usually the clothes are wet from sweat. Those clothes, I'll take one of my dry bags, maybe the one that had my dry clothes in, I'll turn it inside out, and then I'll put my wet clothes into that. I'll roll that up and I'll stick that into the bottom of my sleeping bag, or at least into the inner tent. Now the reason I do that is two things. One, I don't want it to freeze solid overnight because I've got to put it on the next day if I'm doing a multi-day trip. But I've got to put that on again. So whilst it's going to stay wet, it at least won't be frozen. And if I put it at the bottom of my sleeping bag, it could even be warm. The other reason that I do that, I put it into a dry bag, is because if you leave that out in your tent where it's slightly warmer, that moisture will start going out of those clothes and it will form in your tent as condensation. And you will get the most horrific condensation. A lot of the time when I see people having horrendous condensation is because they've got their tent nice and warm inside and they've left their wet clothes out to dry and they've steamed up and it just settles on the inside of the tent and then it becomes condensation. So if you want to avoid having rain almost inside your tent, our priority, remember, is to keep our dry gear dry. My inner tent, my dry clothes, for me, that's one of my things that's mission critical, if you like. It is a must have that I have a set of dry clothes and a dry environment to be in, and that environment stays absolutely dry. And so in order to do that, that's why my wet clothes go into the dry bag. So once you've got that stuff tucked away, you're setting up all your gear inside. So it's important to understand now that once we're in our tent, let's say we're sat in our inner tent, we have to make sure that we're actually going to stay warm in that environment. So firstly, our clothes have to be correct. But the next thing we need to do is be aware of, like, where are we going to actually lose heat from? And the biggest place that we lose heat from when we're in our tent is the ground. The ground sucks heat down. Imagine that you're on a snowy or icy kind of ground, or just very, very cold ground. You can sit on it and you can feel the heat just being pulled away from you. So the first thing I do, and I think it's a really good tip, is I have a windscreen protector. You know, one of those silver windscreen protectors? It's like a really thin layer of foam, just really thin, not much thicker than paper. Well, it's thicker than paper, but it's really thin. And then it's silver on one side. I have the silver side facing up. If you sit on that, that will make the ground go from being, oh, it's too cold to sit on, it's unbearable, to actually this is okay. Then on top of that, I suggest you get a sleeping mat which is insulated. And from my experience, it depends on where you're living. Let's say you're not in the most bleak winter conditions. I'd want something that was an R value of 4. If you don't know what an R value is, it's simply a rating system that's been now recently standardized to say how much insulation a mat provides. So 8 would be really good insulation and 0 would be no insulation at all. A 4 will give you that. I think that's the threshold to me for a mat that's okay for winter. If you can go higher, then that's great. But you don't need to think about getting a massive mat. Or my priority for winter is to think about, is it going to insulate me and keep me warm off the ground? Because that's going to make the biggest difference. I would say this is one of the areas where it's worth spending a bit of money. If your budget's a bit tight, the sleep system for winter, I think winter camping is a little bit more expensive. There's just kind of not that much way around that. But the mat and the sleeping bag are two areas where I would put the money in if you've got it, as best you can, because that's going to really be the stuff that keeps you warm. So that I'll have the silver reflector down first, which is like a windscreen protector, that stops frost and forming on the car windscreens. They're like a £5, or you can get them for £5 or you know, for $5 or $6 in America from eBay. Just buy one, a generic one, a small one. Don't get a big one. Just get a small one, unless it's for 2-man tent. Even then, you could just get 2 small ones. So you've got one for when you're on your own. So it's not so bulky. They're a bit bulky. They don't weigh anything really, but they're bulky. So the other thing you need to think about is your sleeping bag. Again, I would say that you want to get as warm a sleeping bag as you can afford. If you can't afford much in the way of a sleeping bag, something that's good is to look at army surplus stores. Look for Arctic bags from whatever country you're from, and you'll usually find that they're good, but they're very heavy and very bulky. You need to take that into consideration, but they work well other than that. If you can, let's say, afford a 3-season bag, you could wear your down jacket in your sleeping bag as well. You can bring in some extra insulation, take a fleece blanket with you, something like that, to try and up the rating. But those kind of things are stuff that I would test out before you go off into the wilderness with it. I would test that out close to home or close to a situation where you can get out if you need to. The first section of winter camping for me is dry and insulated. Now what we need to do on top of that is to start finding ways that we can generate heat. The situation that we're in, when we're in the tent now, we're dry, we're insulated, that heat's got to come from somewhere, and it can only come from us. You can do, to get some heat immediately into your insulation system, you can do a few sit-ups, a few press-ups, some sort of movement inside your sleeping bag or inside the gear that you're in to try and warm it up. But the real thing that you need to do is, again, that logs on the fire thing. You need to eat. You need to eat a decent amount of calories. And one of the mistakes I see people making on forums online, especially in the winter time, is when they buy these dehydrated meal packs. There's a range of these meal packs, and some of them are really good, and some of them are not what I would call for winter. For instance, if you're walking for 4 or 5 hours in difficult conditions, then you're getting into a tent and you expect a 350 calorie meal to keep you warm, it's probably not going to happen, because you've burnt way more than that. But you're supposed to get this energy from somewhere. You need to have calories. When you're walking in winter conditions, you need to be thinking, it depends on your body and how much weight you're carrying with you and so on. So having meals, dehydrated meals that are 350 calories, that's not going to get you anywhere. You're going to get cold like that. You need to be thinking of meals that are like 1,000 calories, something in that kind of range where it's going to really do something. And across the whole day, especially on multi-day trips, you have to keep those calories up. And the other tip I'd give you is try to make sure that, I see people consistently do this where, and I've done this mistake myself, this is an easy one to do, where you try to get all your calories from carbohydrates, whereas what you need to do is get them from fat and protein and carbohydrates. But I'd say that once you're in your warm conditions, actually the fats and proteins are more important, because they're really your larger logs, if you like. If you want to see it in terms of fire, which is what your body's doing, I guess, see carbs like kindling, that burns quickly and brightly, but it's short-lived. And then you want to have your larger logs on the fire, which is your proteins and your fats. Proteins seem to produce a lot of heat in the body, so it's important that you get these things in. So some of these packets of little pasta and sauce stuff, which seem like a good idea, they're not necessarily that high in calories, they're not going to do that much. But you could take something like that, you could stick a block of cheese into it, and that would transform it into something that's going to give you a lot more energy for a lot longer period of time. Things like nuts work really well, chocolate works well. There's lots of things that you can choose as food sources and that you can think about that you want to carry, but trying to get more balanced meals in is probably the best thing that you can do, and try to avoid those kind of just high carb but low calorie dehydrated meals. And in that situation, you're now dry, you're insulated, and you're fed. And those are the three things I want you to focus on. You have to separate your camping and living system, if you like, into hiking stuff which can be wet, and then you're in the tent gear, if you like, which has to stay dry. Dry, insulated, fed. Those are the three most important principles in order for you to stay warm. And you'll have to work that system out for yourself, depending on what sort of layers you want to go for, what sort of foods you want to go for. And I can't stress this enough, it's really important that you try to practice this stuff in a safer environment. Do simpler hikes. If you're new to winter camping, do simpler journeys. Don't go too far. Don't get yourself into a situation where you'd be okay in the summer, but in the winter this is a nightmare and you're stuck. Okay, get yourself used to these conditions gradually. Pick some smaller hills to start with, or some less remote locations to begin with, and then build up. You can build up quite quickly, but you probably will make some changes pretty early on. The other thing as well with your food, once you've got your dehydrated meals or whatever it is you want to eat into you, hot drinks, get your stove on, get your water warmed up, and you don't have to boil your water each time. This is the thing, if you're thinking about fuel conservation, if you just heat the water up to, let's say it's halfway to boiling, something like that, that's enough for it to have a warming effect when you drink it. You don't have to boil your water all the time, unless you're using that as a way to disinfect your water. But if you've got clean water and you just want to be able to get some warm water into, then use it. So one of the reasons I really like the Nalgene bottle is because with that, what I can do is I can boil water, stick boiling water into my Nalgene bottle, and then I can stick it inside my jacket, or I can chuck it into my sleeping bag. And when that cools down to a point where it's drinkable and warm, I can drink it and then make another one. And that way I'm drinking the water I'm keeping me warm to start with, and then I'm drinking it, and then I'm getting warm water going into me, and that works really well. I can't recommend enough having hot drinks, because hot drinks keep putting warmth into you as well. It makes a really big difference. Okay, but again, I can't stress enough to do your research and practice in safer environments where you can build this up over time. Look at more resources online. Try and get on the Windsor Skills course as well. If you're going to go out and Windsor the first time, it's really worth doing. I originally wanted to make this video for you outside where I could demonstrate this stuff for you, but I live in London where it's stuck indoors again because of you know what, and I continuously can't get out. So I'm trying to make this video like this. I will remake this at some stage and try and show this stuff to you in a more practical sense so it makes more sense to you. But I still hope that was useful, and if you did like that, please let me know, give me some feedback. It would be important to me to hear whether this is useful anyway, so I can keep making more videos like this, and then hopefully later demonstrate it to you when I'm allowed out again properly. If you like this, give me a thumbs up or something, drop me a comment, any questions you've got. If you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe and the bell notification, because I will make more videos like this. Anyway, take care and all the best. Hope you have a good time. Bye bye.